So good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here at the presentation of the Cosmopolitan Constitution, a book which has been published in 2014 by Oxford University Press, and it has been written by Alexander Zomek. This is the book we're going to talk about, and it will provide us with the occasion for a discussion on constitutionalism and the rise, the transformation, and as in the preface the author claims, the potential demise of constitutionalism. So this is the trajectory we are going to cover and to discuss. I have the pleasure of having here the author, Alexander Zomek, and three esteemed colleagues, Professor Marco Goldoni from the University of Glasgow, Professor Andrea Guazzarotti from the University of Ferrara, and Professor Giulio Itzkovic from the University of Brescia. We have decided to structure the discussion in this way. The seminar will be in two parts. In the first part, we will have an introduction by myself, in which I will try to describe, to illustrate the contents of the book in a very sketchy way, just to focus the discussion. And then we'll have the commentators questioning the book. So we'll start with questions, with critical remarks on the book. And after the break, the author will have a chance to reply and to engage with the comments put forward by commentators. And then there will be the opportunity for you to ask questions, to interact with the panel. As I said, the book is very ambitious and I would say also very difficult. It's not an easy reading. It's not a book that you can just skim through. If you really want to go into it, it requires an effort, I would say, and that's why it is a good book, I would say. Since the preface, it aims at tracking this trajectory, a trajectory which is structured on three phases, called with Microsoft language, I would say, Constitutionalism 1.0, Constitutionalism 2.0, and Constitutionalism 3.0. Constitutionalism 3.0 being the Cosmopolitan Constitution, so the last evolutionary stage on which the book focuses. And the style of the book is mainly theoretical, although the evolution implies a certain degree of historical dimension. It is not abstract theory. It is a theory which is always contextualized, because Constitutionalism 1.0 takes as a paradigm example the American Constitution. Constitutionalism 2.0 takes as a paradigm example the German Constitution. And Constitutionalism 3.0, it doesn't claim it explicitly, but it focuses essentially on the public law arrangements emerged in Europe, both under the ECHR and the law of the European Union. The third aspect I would like to point out in this introduction of the introduction is that it is not a book on global constitutionalism. Until now, there is a rather abundant literature has emerged on the topic of global constitutionalism, being understood as constitutionalism beyond the state, the process of constitutionalization of the European Union, the process of constitutionalization of the CHR, and there are authors also claiming that the WTO has been constitutionalized. So there is a literature claiming that constitutional ideas have migrated towards non-state entities. This is only this is a marginal aspect of the book. The book touches upon this topic, but the focal point of the book is rather different. It is the idea of the cosmopolitan constitution is not a constitution which has developed beyond the state, but it is the transformation of the national constitution because of membership in international organization. It is the national constitution engaging with non-state entities, with global administrative law, with other sites of governance which are beyond the state. So it is the transformation of the national constitution rather than the migration of constitutional concepts beyond the state. As I said, in trying to give a sketchy presentation of the contents of the book, I don't want to, it would be impossible to provide a comprehensive description. So I will try just to underline the structure and identify the main themes of the book with a view to provide the opportunity to prepare the ground for the commentators who are going to develop certain of these themes. So Constitutionalism 1.0 is about the rise of constitutionalism, is about the rise of the establishment of modern constitutions, and as I said, the US Constitution is the paradigm example in this regard. The analysis of the US Constitution, at least in my reading, is framed with a view to distance it from previous public law arrangements, and in particular the tradition of mixed constitutions. It is a constitution whose distinctive elements are, for instance, the fact that it is the first constitution in which constituent power has been exercised. It is a constitution authored by the people. The people is the entity that raises above all other powers. In this regard, Zomek draws extensively from the work of Thomas Paine, establishing that the Constitution is a product of the will of the people, which establishes and constrains government. And modern constitutionalism is about limiting, but also establishing and framing government. And the Constitution relies on this dialectic, this tension between the law of the people, the Constitution, and government, which is a product of the Constitution and which is an agent, to some extent, of the Constitution. The Constitution uses for the first time law to establish power, not just to regulate power, as it was done previously, and it is comprehensive, so it claims that all public power which is exercised in a polity is connected, is generated, let's say, by the Constitution. Of course, it is written, and its substantive dimension is centered on liberty understood as a negative freedom, as freedom of choice. It is the Constitution that establishes a clear distinction between civil society, the domain of private law, of private interactions, and, as said, government, the state. The state, which is conceived as limited, using the terms employed by the author, government is a functionally specified instantiation of sovereign power, which relies on the concept of checks and balances which are distanced from the mixed constitution, given that the mixed constitution wanted just to regulate existing power, not power that have been generated by the Constitution. In this context, judicial review of legislation is a judicial review of legislation that is centered on competencies. As we know, judicial review of legislation is a byproduct of federalism. The first case, Marbury versus Madison, is not a case revolving on fundamental rights, but is a case revolving on federalism. But also fundamental rights, constitutional rights, are conceived in that environment as competencies. The author claims in a very effective way, I would say, that rights are conceived as a negative competence norms, as fields which are excluded from the remit of government. And the role of the court is to protect this distinction of competencies vis-à-vis the civil society, the individual, vis-à-vis the entities composing government itself. So this is the general image provided of Constitutionalism 1.0. Constitutionalism 2.0 is about the evolution emerged essentially in Europe, but not necessarily in Europe, after World War II. So the reference points are the democratic constitution, and in particular the German Basic Law. Here, analysis emphasizes the changes in respect to Constitutionalism 1.0. According to the author, and I'm sure this is a point that can be discussed and will raise issues, Constitutionalism 2.0 is or traces the eclipse of constituent power, the abdication of sovereignty. These are terms used by the author. The Constitution, in his view, is no longer the free choice of the people, but it is more an act of reasonable recognition by the people concerning fundamental rights, concerning the supreme value of human dignity, which is the driving element, at least from a substantive perspective, of Constitutionalism 2.0. In this context, constitutional rights are reconfigured. They are no longer negative competence norms. They are conceived in a totally different environment. They are not the rights conceived in an individualistic perspective, but they are rights conceived in a communitarian perspective, in a perspective in which social interdependence between individuals is highly valued and enhanced by the Constitution. From this, a number of consequences follow. For instance, that rights are no longer perceived as rules, but they are treated as principles which are pervasive, which allow a moral catharsis of the society and of the legal order. They exercise a radiating effect, to use the sentence employed by the Bundesverfassungsgericht in the founding judgment in the Lut case, on which the author spent a lot of very interesting pages. And again, this is a point on which perhaps we will discuss. This gives rise to, I would say ironically, a constitution in which the Schmittian predilection for a substantive approach is incorporated. Liberty in this context is no longer a pre-constitutional given. It is an entity that requires not only abstention from government, but legislative elaboration. This brings about a change in normativity. The effect of the Constitution is no longer an effect related to the interpretation of constitutional norms, but the focal point of constitutional adjudication shifts towards the principle of proportionality, balancing, and the ponderation of competing fundamental rights and interests. This, according to the author, gives rise to a situation in which priority is given to judicial expositions of the Constitution. Constitutional courts are the focal point of the new legal and political order, and their activity centers on human dignity. In my view, the part on human dignity of the book is the most interesting, and I find it fascinating, because the effort of Alexander Zomek is to recontextualize human dignity in the historical background that gave rise to it. We tend nowadays to understand human dignity in a liberal and individualized conception as the freedom from degrading treatment, where degrading treatment is essentially degrading treatment perpetrated by state or public authorities. What Zomek tells us is that originally, so right after World War II, dignity was conceived with, of course, with an attention to the horrors emerged during the war, during the Holocaust, but the focal point was not the Holocaust in itself, but were the root causes of the Holocaust, the root causes of the totalitarian regimes. In this context, human dignity is a synonym for emancipation of the individual in the circumstances of social interdependence. So the focal point is not the abuses of the state, of public authorities, but are the possibility for individuals to extricate themselves from the circumstances of ungoverned economic interdependence. Using the language of an Italian economist and constitutional lawyer, Saraceno, the Constitution is about protecting the individual from the anarchy of markets. Is, in the language of Zomek, the human dignity is about protecting the individual from the vagaries of markets, from ananke, I think is the... So from necessity, which is not governed by the individual. So that's the original core, which is traced back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Second Bill of Rights proposed by Roosevelt during the New Deal. Constitutionalism 3.0, as I said, is about a next step in the evolution of national constitutions. Constitutionalism 3.0 is about constitutions, national constitutions, that for the purpose of self-correction yield to the judgment of one's peers, of national governments, of international organization, providing a further level of checks and balances within the comprehensive institutional arrangement. The themes touched upon by the author in this regard are several. I would like to point out a few of them. First of all, the more immediate is the tension between universality in the protection of fundamental rights, a particularity, the tension between constitutional identity, if you want, and universal fundamental rights. In his view, this gives rise to a situation which contemporary legal theorists and constitutional lawyers have portrayed as the re-emergence of legal pluralism that, in Zomek's view, amounts to a revival of political constitutionalism. So legal pluralism gives rise to a situation which is a situation in which the abundance of law paradoxically gives room to an absence of the law, because the entities involved in legal pluralism are entities that manage their mutual interactions not really according to legal criteria, but according to mutual deference based on political conventions. In this context, the people, constituent power, which already had been relativized under Constitutionalism 2.0, is further eclipsed and, in his word, is perceived as embarrassing. The Constitutionalism 3.0 is a post-popular constitutionalism. It's the constitutionalism of apolitical individuals aspiring only to the protection of universal principles, to crisis management, to risk regulation. This gives rise to an institutional setting focused on the ascendancy of the executive branch of government, where politics shifts from a situation in which it was meant to plan ahead under Constitutionalism 2.0 to a situation under Constitutionalism 3.0 in which politics is played out in a more reactive mode. Politics is not about planning for the future, but it's just about reacting to crisis. It's about keeping pace with technological innovation. It's not a forward-looking politics. And this gives rise to a polity that, at least in my reading, is a rather, in a legal and political order, which is rather gloomy, in which it is a polity marked by a conflict between insiders of these regulatory projects, market actors, and the outsiders of this regulatory project. It is, in the words of the author, a conflict between the smart few and the powerless many. And this conflict is regarded somehow as an intractable conflict. It's not a conflict which can be mediated. Or, and this is a very provocative point raised in a couple of parts of the last chapters by Zomek, perhaps the only way to institutionalize this conflict, to mediate it, is a return to pre-modern constitutionalism, to the model of the mixed constitution that was put forward by Machiavelli, a constitution that entrenches the existence of competing sectors of the society that have different powers, and a new order, political and legal order, is a legal order in which these differences are recognized and entrenched to some extent. And perhaps this is the point in which I disagree more with the author. And yes, I think I can stop here because the sketchy presentation perhaps is sufficiently sketchy. And I would like to thank again all the participants, and I think we can start with Andrea or Marco. Would you like to start, Marco? Okay. So you have 24 minutes. 20. Okay.
So, I guess does it work? Can you hear me? More or less, yeah. Not much, I can see. Now, when you are invited to this type of events, there is I would say, collective expectation, not that you are here to criticize the author. I think this is fairly the expectation that we all share here. So, let me first of all put things straightforward on the table. I'm very sympathetic with this project. So I will try now to squeeze some criticism out of it. So if this comes across as a bit either convoluted or artificial, forgive me, but this is because somehow it's the role that I need to play. So there will be a certain element of artificiality. Now, having said this, I will avoid any type of praise, and I will plunge immediately into a couple of points that I want to raise and with which I want to engage with Zomek. Now, as Marco brilliantly reconstructed before, this is a book that talks about, it has a narrative that talks about a trajectory of modern constitutionalism. There is the main protagonist of the book surprisingly so to a certain extent, in my view, is not the constitution, but it is the state. The state is the real protagonist here, to a point where the book, in fact, actually confirms, in my view, this perception, because it ends, it rounds off this reconstruction with a claim, by claiming back the role of the state for modern and contemporary constitutionalism. Precisely because, but this is, I'm not sure about this, but this is my reading, precisely because the state offers the only political form available, still available today, in order to set up necessary conditions for political self-determination, which, to a certain extent, using Zomek's language, is fundamentally political action. A form of politics that is not simply reactive, but it is capable of arising above necessity. Okay? Now, having said this, it is slightly surprising to see that the state appears only in a scattered manner throughout the book. There is no single systematic treatment of what is the state, for example. You would expect, coming from that type of scholarship, that at least we would be told, first of all, how to explain the origins of the state, secondly, what is the constitutional relevance of the state, and thirdly, what are the material elements that make up the state. Now, let me throw there a couple of examples. I mean, take a couple of projects that have recently focused, I would say, particularly on the state. One is Martin Laughlin's Political Jurisprudence. The other one is Societal Constitutionalism, in particular in the form given to it by Chris Thorney. So the idea there is, on one hand, Laughlin has this idea that the state is, of course, the only political form that allows for political action. Why? Because fundamentally it's the outcome of a process of secularization. It's fundamentally Koselleck's thesis of the state arising out of a process of separation between religion and politics, which of course, and this is the catch, which I think with which Zomek might be sympathetic, this is of course the precondition for granting some form of autonomy to politics. Of course, Thorney's project, which is rooted in a more functionalist understanding of the development of constitutionalism, traces the origin of the state back to a functional differentiation between different systems, one of course being between religion and politics, but then of course law and so forth and so on, science, education. And they are not I would say the secret of the success of the state is that the state is there in order to provide a repository of public resources. The state becomes a mechanism which creates the public sphere, and it literally allows political action because it depatrimonializes aspects of politics. So both theses come up with an idea of the autonomy of politics, which is premised on the establishment of the modern state. And the modern state is that type of device. It's a highly selective device. Now, I don't want to now go into details of these two theories, but if we compare Zomek's narrative, let's call it narrative, of the development of state constitution with those things, what I think is ambiguous in the book is that you might have a perception that state constitutions, so not only constitutions, but state constitutions are or provide the preconditions for political action, but this is never fully sketched out. So I tend to believe, but this is what it is, I believe, I tend to believe that that he would agree that the state provides the conditions for political autonomy. And this, in my view, is confirmed by the role that is played throughout the three stages of development by necessity, as the counter side of political action and of political autonomy. Why? Let's put it like this: why the state and state constitutions do represent an achievement? They do precisely because they provide the conditions in order to overcome certain forms of necessity. Now, so far so good, no, to a certain extent, except that without providing, no, in a book that is, sorry, let me add a proviso, in a book that is fundamentally an exercise in understanding modern constitutionalism, right? I hope I'm right on this. So this is not a normative take on modern constitutionalism. This is an exercise in understanding modern constitutionalism. It is obvious that the way you choose the starting point and the type of narrative that you adopt in order to describe the transformations are key. They are, I think, the main tenets upon which you test the solidity of the hypothesis that is put forward here. No? Now, given that we are not exactly told what are the origins of the state, no, we are simply told that constitutionalism 1.0 begins as a process of emancipation, which is, I think, in a certain sense, a fairly accurate thesis. No, it is a process of emancipation for certain types of necessity that were created, of course, by a particular social arrangement, which we called feudalism. No? So what you have is state constitutions 1.0, which is basically the beginning, the inception of modern state constitutions, premised on the idea that you need to overcome, no, the necessity created by feudal arrangements, fundamentally by introducing formal freedoms. Equalize people by introducing formal freedoms. It's a classic liberal understanding of the origins of state constitutions. No? And in fact, and here I think, in my view, there is something slightly problematic in this narrative, and in fact, Zomek is quite willing to buy into the idea, no, that state constitution somehow grow out of societal interaction. And again, there is a slight ambiguity there, which I mean, I would have preferred to see this somehow state more clearly. The ambiguity is the following one. No? So either the state and society are fundamentally in an external relationship, and this is perfectly compatible with modern liberalism. No? You have societal interaction, you have a certain type of rights, expectations, and so forth, and so interests that are already there in societal interaction. On this, no, it emerges slowly, no, usually in a cunning way. No? It's the Hegelian build of the state, that there is a structure, no, imposed on society. No? And this is, no, in constitutions 1.0 is fundamentally the way to introduce formal freedoms, no? And to restructure society in that way, externally. No? This is the point that I want to stress, externally. So that society and the state, no, remains two separate entities, no, constitutional entities. No? That's why so much emphasis on Thomas Paine. No? In Paine, this is pristine, I would say. No? The state government, not even the state government. The government is way far from being the state, but government comes, no, on society, but after society. So the organization of societal interaction is already there way before. Now this is questionable, in my view. Questionable, and my impression is that for the type of project that is put forward here is, to a certain extent, I'm not so sure whether it will yield the fruits that Zomek hopes somehow to collect at the end of his reconstruction. No? I think an internal perspective, one that immediately states from the beginning that modern society is implicated, intertwined, and selectively constructed by process of state buildings, no, would have somehow, I think, provided a more, I would say, critical stance on the three transformations of state constitution. And in my view, it would have given, and I will try to round off this at the end of my intervention, it would have given more traction for criticizing constitutionalism 3.0. But I will come back to this one at the end. So fundamentally, I think the narrative that concerns the state is unduly underplayed here. So that there is so much emphasis on constitutions and institutions, no, legislator, administrators, and judiciary, but there is no clear discussion on the role of the state. Now, which brings me to the second point. The second point is precisely the idea that if constitutionalism is a process of emancipation, it is such a process because it creates political autonomy. And this is again something that is intuitively quite appealing, because the idea there would be that modern actors in the constitutional scene are not fully determined by necessity, not by conditions of necessity. But again, my impression is that even at this stage, even at the level of the juxtaposition between necessity and political action, we still see traces of an external understanding of the relationship between society and state. Why? Well, precisely because necessity and political action are understood here, at least, again, I would like somehow to engage with you on this, are again understood as different spheres. So necessity is literally something at a certain point becomes like nature. There is some, I would say, brilliant pages on how necessity is somehow constructed through social interactions, mostly, say, through market imperatives in Constitutionalism 3.0, and I somehow agree with that. But this is far from being nature. This is fully constructed from the beginning, selectively fully constructed from the origin. So the European stability mechanism is not the outcome of necessity. The European stability mechanism is the way to establish necessity. I mean, this is, in my view, difficult to contest. But if you understand it in this way, then the narrative that separates modern societies and states shows its limitations, in my view, at least epistemically, as a matter of constitutional doctrine. Because what you see is a completely different process. And on the other hand, and I think this is just an aside comment, there is possibly too much emphasis put on the value of political autonomy. To the point that while I was reading the book, I was thinking that there is a sort of romanticization, if I may say so. I don't know whether this word exists in English. I don't think so. It's a form of Italianism. Okay. But you understand what I mean, no? Of this idea that political participation is a good in itself. It is an intrinsic good. So, and that's why constitutionalism is such a nice thing, because it, by providing the possibility, the conditions for political participation, then it means that it helps fostering a culture of political participation and the possibility even of political participation. Now I wonder why would you want political participation and political autonomy as a way to overcome necessity rather than as a way to transform the perception of necessity? Now, these are two different projects in my view. They might. I'm not so sure whether they could coexist. I'm not so sure the one exclude the other. But definitely, there is, at least in terms of outcomes, a difference in understanding political autonomy as the moment where you emancipate yourself from necessity. So you take somehow a sort of detachment from necessity, and you enter into a sphere where your actions are not determined by material constraints. And it's quite a different thing to understand political action and political participation as a way to restructure societal interaction. And that is the processes that set up the condition of necessity. These are, in my view, two different processes. They might be compatible. I don't have a strong opinion on this, and maybe we can have a discussion. And last point, the last point that I want to make, after the one on the state and the one on necessity, is on the trajectory that is described in the book, which I think is to a certain extent coherent with the starting point. So if constitutionalism modern constitutionalism is a process of emancipation from certain type of necessity. We see, in my view at least, in this story, in the story contained in this book, we see that there is some form of, in my view, dialectic development there. So you have a certain form of necessity, which somehow triggers then, and I'm sorry for the repetition, the necessity or the need to overcome it. But again, the overcoming of that necessity then brings about again the conditions for new necessities. And again, of course, then you will have to react against this. Now, maybe I'm simplifying, and this is a trivial Hegelian take on this, even though, in my view, this is fundamentally that type of project from the very beginning. And if this is the case, and so if the transformation, because while I was reading the book, I was thinking, but why do we have a change from 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0? Because this is a key question in my view. Why do we have a transformation? And it seems that somehow there is these changes are triggered by an internal rationality. So they are there from the beginning. That's why I insist that the point of origin should be chosen very carefully, because it contains already the seeds of what will come later. Now, I don't have anything relevant to say on the content of these three moments of transformation. I have no clue whether these are the correct, accurate moments of transformation. It's it's a sweeping claim. Zomek definitely knows better than I do, so somehow following Ras, I defer to his authority and I say, just look, I don't engage and I trust you. But what is intriguing is the way that the transformation is described, that comes across, in my view, more as a form of continuity than as a form of grafting, as you suggest at a certain point. There's exactly only once there is the idea that each stage is a graft onto the previous one. It's a fantastic image, in my view. This would have been really, in my view, it will bring about a lot of potential developments, because then, of course, the grafting, you don't know how it's going to act on the host. You graft something onto a host, you don't know whether the things that is grafted is going to be transformed or the host is going to be transformed, and how and why. While somehow I have the impression that all of this is unfolds as a matter more of a dialectic process rather than a grafting. Because when you have a grafting, you have an unstable situation, which is, in my view, quite exciting. This is what opens up possibilities of political action. You have an unstable situation because you don't know how the process of the grafting will unfold. But if this is a dialectic, cunning process, then I'm not so sure. I don't want to end up with a note of, optimism, pessimism. I'm not interested about this. But then I'm not so sure whether the whole process was simply just, doomed to reach a certain stage. And I want to just add one quick last thing. One of the reasons why I don't see many arguments about this in the book, why it could have been different, for example, is because somehow we talk a lot about symptoms in the book, symptoms of created by these social interactions, necessities, not much about active subjects actually. So we don't see who are actually the agents of transformation. It's not clear at all. It seems that transformation is triggered at the end of the day by a dialectic process that is in the structure of things, not much really in collective agency. But on this note, I must say I'm quite cautious because I'm maybe over-reading what you've written. I think that's enough.
Thank you very much, Marco, for these very thoughtful comments. would leave the floor to Andrea Guazzarotti.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Marco, for the invitation, and which gives me the occasion to discuss this wonderful book. I already discovered this book one year, the last year, because of engaging. I was engaging myself with the disillusion of the European Convention on Human Rights, and so I took a wonderful quotation about the ideology underlying this multi-level system, which is quite exact. I participated in a conference with a lot of lawyers, and they were crazy about European Convention on Human Rights system, and it was really disappointing in a way, because they didn't grasp the political crisis of the system. They were just interested in output, as you say, in legal outputs. Thank you. Excuse me. But I have to come to the point. I have no structured comments, just a very impressionist mode of a commentary of the book. But first thing is about the Constitutionalism 2.0. Which is, in my opinion, very focused on the German model, but it ignores, of course, you cannot be omniscient. It ignores the Italian tradition, which, in a way, was influenced by the constitutional knowledge, the German constitutional knowledge, for sure. But the political genesis is important of the Italian constitution, because more than the German one, the Italian constitution was based on party politics, on political pluralism. It was the gist of the model. If you read a work of a former Italian justice, a former member of the Italian Constitutional Court, Silvestri, who wrote in the 80s a book and then an encyclopedical voice on separation of power, the separation of power. He analyzed the evolution, as you did in your book, the evolution of constitutionalism 1.0 to 2.0. So in a welfare state, in a social state, the strong separation of power is impossible. So the model is not more feasible, cannot work. But he concluded, so far as I remember, today, we were in the beginning of the 80s, today the functional equivalent is the plurality of parties. They are the device, then this pluralism, political pluralism, is the device who guarantees a sort of balance of power inside the 2.0 Constitution. So in Italy we had this idea that political pluralism was strongly linked to the Constitution. And of course all that stuff is strongly is in a deep crisis now. And I would like to quote an image of another Italian constitutional lawyer, scholar, which is Dogliani from the University of Turin, who some years ago, few years ago, wrote a very critical paper against the form of government and the importance, the transformation of the Italian form of government, and the excessive importance which the government as an institution was achieving because of the crisis of political parties. He utilized this image. The Italian Constitution was conceived as a vertebrated animal, and then we have the work of Mortati, the Costituzione Materiale. So the Constitution alone is not enough. The true life in the Constitution are how the hegemonic political forces make Constitution function. And the problem is when these political forces are dead, it was the passage from the first Italian Republic to the Second Republic. We used to, it's a bad imitation of the French model, evolution of a constitution. But it's right. The parties, political parties of the who wrote the constitution, dead in 93. So if the political party system is no more living, we don't have any more vertebrated animal. We have an exoskeleton like insects. Political parties still tend to defend themselves, hiding behind the institutional structure, and the most powerful of them is the government. So now we have, for instance, a big change for the leftist culture. The chief of the party, Partito Democratico, the former Communist Party, merged with the remains of Democrazia Cristiana and so on. So the Democratic Party, for the very first time, had his the chief of the party who claimed to be also the prime minister. The UK model. It's quite a message. So that's the first point I would like to stress about how to enlarge the picture. Constitutional 2.0 was about political parties and their role inside the constitutional state. But I would like to come back to this issue at the end when I will speak about the mixed constitution, so the neo-Machiavellian model. But I don't know if I had time enough. But anyway, a second impression I would like to discuss is I would start with what this book let me think at the very beginning. I would make a comparison with a book of Carl Schmitt the nomos der Erde, nomos della terra. Maybe you quote a lot Carl Schmitt, but maybe you didn't use that much this book, because I could find analogies, but also differences. The strongest analogy is that you believe in a strong link between a bounded polity, a bounded space, and political sovereignty, self-determination of the people, and constitution, and constitutionalism. You need bounded polities, and you criticize sharply, and I agree with you, all those who promote boundless polities. And the same, maybe not the same, but I have the impression that something similar you share with the ideas of Schmitt in Nomos der Erde. He claimed that without borders, clear borders, you cannot have law at all. The idea of normativity. He make this dichotomy between the boundless idea of law that the Anglo-Saxon culture had, and the bounded theory of public power, Ius publicum Europaeum, that the German culture had. But in this book, he criticized also the geopolitical evolution. In this book, you find a lot of geopolitics, which, in my opinion, I would have liked to find in your book, because everybody would like to add his own tendencies in his heroes in a way, because I think you started in writing against this globalization wave in a very difficult time when it was difficult to criticize, at least at the international level of publication. So he sharply criticized not the United Kingdom approach, it was already dead, but the United States approach about international relations and so on, and the false idea that you can have an association of equal independent states. If every kind of political unity, like in Africa and so on, can be state, so nobody is a state anymore. So he sharply criticized the geopolitics of the United States. And maybe his idea was, of course, to defend the German utopia of a new compact, sort of new empire, Holy Roman Empire. The idea is, and the problem is how to build more than one hegemonic subject in today's world. At that time, he thought it was a bad idea to leave all the direction of international geopolitics to United States, and maybe it was an idea shared by Keynes. The Keynesian model was not followed in the Bretton Woods agreement. He wasn't against the more important thing that it wasn't against. He was against the idea that the United States currency could serve as the world currency. He conceived another model with a truly independent currency. So now I come to the point. In your book, you here and there you say that you are not against friendly and peaceful relations, friendly and sympathetic international relations among states. So it's a way to solve the problem. You are not saying we have to return to a very aggressive period of international relation, but that, let me read, because my English is so poor and I need to read my in my opinion, international relations are flawed by asymmetries of power, and the European Union and in general supranational institutions are specifically designed to overcome such asymmetries, enabling member states to pooling their sovereignties in order to obtain due respect by United States or China or whatever the hegemon is in the at the moment. And in another part of your book, you make rightly a point against this boundless utopia, which can be, and we have experimented, a very dangerous utopia. A country sustaining high level of social protection may insulate itself against competitive pressures that originate from societies embracing authoritarian capitalism. The problem with this idea, I share this idea, but is it Keynesian model possible in only one state? It was the utopia of Mitterrand when he came to power, but in less than 1 year it was defeated by the monetary politics policy of the Bundesbank. If you are not, if your Keynesian policies are not coordinated, then you will fail. The defense could be, of course, capital's flows control over capital movement. But exactly what I was affirming. So Keynesian model in one state, as you rightly point. Why not? If I want to follow a Keynesian state, I need a bounded polity. But the Keynesian model presupposes not only nation states insulated through currency exchange rate policies, but it presupposes also a great deal of coordination. So the Bretton Woods institution, control over capitals, and so on. But when imperial powers such as the United States decide to liberalize the movement of capitals, as it happened at the beginning of the 70s, how should other other states react? Exactly in Trento, you discussed, I remember, Marco, you were there, discussed a book of economist lawyer, public economy lawyer, Giuseppe Di Gasperi, about his interpretation of this shift. He pointed to the fact that capital liberalization was a decision made. It was a political decision, so nothing is inevitable. I agree with Marco. Nothing is natural. It was a deliberative decision made by United States, when they understood that it was impossible to sustain the golden standard. But if you abandon the golden standard, then you have to prove that you have a balance of payment in functioning, in equilibrium. It was, of course, impossible at that time because of the growing efforts of German economy and of Japanese economy. So, in order to keep their hegemony, the United States decided to liberalize capital. So they decided, fundamentally, it's a political decision to abandon the previous Rooseveltian model, Keynesian model, and to enter in the global financial, globalized financial model. Exactly the idea of Carl Schmitt. You have hegemony, and then how you can arrange it. So maybe it's another way to read the passage from 2.0 to 3.0. But if you read in this way, then you have the problem of maintaining supranational units, exactly in order to balance such hegemonic decisions. Another point is about your yes, you used several times this a very powerful image of virtual representation of foreigners. Foreigners are democratically represented in a polity, which is not their own polity, through a well-working democratic process and the principle of the equality without discrimination on grounds of nationality. It's an expedient for virtual representation because their interests are shared by a minority, a majority in of the political parties, of the political forces with right to vote in their host country, and so they are in a way represented. I'm asking if it's not too optimistic view, because if you have as you say, a relatively liberal immigration policy, or if you has a high level of labor mobility and in general person mobility, this simple fact of high level of expected mobility will alter the political process in a very simple way. We are witnessing that the host political community will tend to cut or make arrangement to their welfare system in order to avoid the so-called welfare tourism, in order to something against the poor foreigner, and on the contrary, they will tend to lower taxes for in order to attract the richest migrants. So we have an interference, and I'm asking if it's simply a problem of my comprehension, to concrete vision of something that is not on this plane, or it has something to do with this. I mean, this problem of foreign poor and foreign rich moving across borders ended in a dichotomy: privatization of welfare versus supranational redistribution. So my utopia is still that if you want to give immigrants an effective virtual representation, you need a supranational level of regulation and redistribution, not only regulation, also redistribution. So the redistribution of the economic gains expected by freedom of movement. Even some famous economist like Danny Roderick, who is very skeptical about economic globalization, is in favor of labor mobility. Naturally, of course, it must be regulated, but the point is exactly the redistribution that you can expect from labor mobility. I come to the end. Just very briefly, in my opinion, is a provocation, of course, but what is the agent of this transformation from 1.0 to 2.0 and to 2.0 to 3.0? If you ask to Marxist economists in Italy, at least, we invited in my department 2 weeks ago Sergio Cesarato, who wrote a very successful book, handbook on political economy. He is fiercely against the euro, but he admits it's very, very difficult to exit. The answer will be threat. It was threat who inspired Roosevelt to introduce social rights in the United States system, maybe also to support this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because Roosevelt arrived the power after the famous Red Scare in the United States. In the 20s. You had a communist American party. You had a very big successful strike and so on. So that was the threat. And then the passage from 2.0 to 3.0 is simply the end of the threat. Cesarato and others says, also a former politician, Lamalfa, says, please boys, we cannot hide ourselves. Why we introduced social rights and we had the 30 glorious, the 30 glorious, from the end of the 40s to the beginning of the 70s? Because of a threat made by the Soviet model. The Soviet model was something who empowered social movement, leftist social movement, Communist Party in Italy and so on in Europe. And capital feared about it. It was a powerful alternative model. After that, we have no more incentive for the happy few, for the 1% of the richest and the wealthiest people in society. And if I can take a minute or two, I would conclude pointed to your idea of mixed constitution. I've spoken about threat. So my question is it something that you suggest as a solution, or is just a threat? Because at the end of the book, if I'm correct, you say if we don't keep the sovereignty of the people, popular sovereignty, at the center of the model, of the constitutionalism model, then we will come back to the pre-constitutional model, the mixed constitution. But in other parts of the book, you it seems that you think it's a good way to react. You compare a true pluralism of the mixed constitution made by different classes, different societal forces with different interests, and the false pluralism of the constitutional pluralism of the fan of boundless polity and constitutionalism beyond the state. So we can schematize democracy beyond the state does not function, but democracy beyond class struggle does not function. The problem is, following the neo-Machiavellian model, are we still within a democratic system? Because this mixed society, a mixed constitution, was a Middle Age idea, and so it was the idea linked to a ranked society, a society of estates. But as far as I could understand, in such a model with separate representative political bodies, one for each class, we in the modernity we have at least two problems. One is that of social mobility. This model presupposes that social mobility doesn't exist, and in our crisis, I would say yes, it's true. Exactly why social mobility revealed itself as a fake idea. We can support this old idea of mixed constitution. And the second is that in such a system with different representative political bodies, the problem is that system needs a king or an ultimate monocratic authority capable of making the political synthesis after having received the cahier de doléances by the different states. Each one have to defend their own interest and then present it to a final authority who make this final balance, final synthesis. Excuse me for my bad English. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. You added a lot of elements which I think are useful for the discussion. You also touched a few points that I also would have liked to raise, so thank you. You anticipated a number of issues.
Yes, thank you, Marco, for the invitation and the floor. And thank you to Zomek for the book, which was a very thought-provoking and I think it works, actually. I should speak perhaps more directly in the microphone. So it was really an interesting reading, which I organized my speech in this way. So I would start with a sort of summary of some of the themes which one encounters in the book. So, well, for the benefit of the audience, but also for the benefit of myself, in the sense that you will be able to correct my possible misunderstanding in your reply, and then we raise some questions and criticism in order to foster the discussion. I'd like to start with this remark. Marco Goldoni said that, I think correctly, that this book is an exercise in understanding modern constitutionalism, and that's certainly true. It has clear theoretical ambitions, but it also has certain equally clear normative commitments, as well as normative outcomes of the book. And well, as far as the normative conclusion of the book is concerned, I'd like to simply read the last sentence of the book, which no emancipation is possible without political action. To this end, the nation state appears today more indispensable than ever before. So there's a clear point that you make there, but not only here. So this is a clear normative conclusion as well, and there is also a normative commitment, so a sort of Wertbeziehung, a relation to a value, which is social freedom. No? Social freedom is, I think, the core value. So the vicissitudes of constitutionalism unfold under the scrutiny of this commitment to social freedom, or substantive freedom. I think it would be clear for an Italian, because with substantive freedom, so it's something that you develop along the lines of the Hegelian substanzielle Freiheit, which is definitely not, it's not market freedom, it's not simply freedom of choice, although it might include also individual moral agency in a way, but clearly not, so to say, the abstract morality of an individual in isolation. So social freedom or substantive freedom for Hegel and for yourself is the kind of freedom that we have as member of an ethical community, who comply with the duties that apply to us. And by complying with our duties and with our performing our social roles and social responsibility, we are freed, according to Hegel, from natural necessity and also from that kind of dependence that we experience in civil society. Dependence from the market, dependence. In a way, we are able to organize ourselves or to be part of a collective body, and that makes, so to say, collective self-determination possible in your narrative. This is an important point that you raise, and solidarity. So that means social justice, redistributive policies. They all depend on this core value or commitment to social freedom. No? So the point is the relation between social freedom and the state. I would like to go into that issue, basically. Yeah? Is the state still the place of social freedom, or do we enjoy social freedom also when we interact and take part to other communities? But let me go slowly in that direction. So social freedom. And social freedom is the history of constitutionalism, yes, is, in a way, constitutionalism is both, so to say, the premise. Social freedom is both the premise and the outcome of constitutionalism. Constitutionalism is conceived as a project of emancipatory politics aimed at protecting and strengthening social freedom vis-à-vis the state and vis-à-vis the market. So, and the state and the market represent both an opportunity for social freedom to flourish, but also a threat to social freedom. No? And you say, and that's an interesting point, that social freedom becomes, so to say, a self-conscious commitment of constitutionalism with the move from constitutionalism 1.0 to constitutionalism 2.0. No? So that's an interesting and I think reading. Yes, because it becomes clear that the risk of domination is not only originated by the state, but also by, so to say, it is also intrinsic to an unfettered market economy. So the aggregate consequences of private transactions may be detrimental to the public good. So basically, no? And so the focus of constitutionalism shifts from fundamental rights as rights against the state to achieving and maintaining an objective order of values. So, and here there's a reading that you make of the case law of the Bundesverfassungsgericht. So we have this idea of positive obligations on the legislator, horizontal effects of fundamental rights, so they do not apply only to public authorities but also to individuals in private transactions. They do not, fundamental rights do not derive their binding force from the will of the people. Constituent power is thrown away, but from an act of recognition of their intrinsic value. So, and human dignity. You provide also a criticism of human dignity once it is conceived as a source of an individual right, source of individual right, because human dignity is basically social freedom. It's another way of expressing this idea of social freedom. It's the authentic source of constitutional rights, and that means that constitutional rights can and should be balanced from time to time with public interests, because the public is the political community is the source of these rights in a way. So so far so good. And the problem for me, in a way, emerged with the move from constitutionalism 2.0, from constitutionalism 2.0 to constitutionalism 3.0. No, and in that regard, well, your explicit aim is to provide the reader with a comprehensive, full-fledged picture of constitutionalism 3.0 that is not a unilateral, one-sided reading, but there are pros and cons, so there are good and bad, and you want to simply say it's good, it's bad. So there are various features that define this. And let me summarize some of these features. First, it is the cosmopolitan constitution in the sense of the constitution of a state, of nation states under condition of international engagement. You're right. No? Is characterized by forms of peer review, and you think basically that monitor compliance with human rights standards. The European Convention of Human Rights is the avant-garde, the forefront of constitution. Okay. So the contracting parties submit themselves to this kind of peer review, which is not so acknowledging a superior authority, but allowing for some control mechanism that strengthen their commitments to, okay. And the doctrine of margin of appreciation, while proportionality was, so to say, the typical legal reasoning instruments of the second point zero, constitutionalism, the margin of appreciation in the sense that it's a flexible tool for managing the interactions of constitutional pluralism. Yes, this is the first characteristic. Second one is what you call, and this topic has not yet emerged, so I'm happy to bring it to the table, empowering proportionality. Mm-hmm. That is basically emergency powers. So, when confronted with a threat of a certain magnitude, executive powers have to be proportionate to that threat. That would be the rationale. It is a constitutionalism in a time of emergency. And necessitas non habet legem. So no strict rule is applicable in time of emergency, and so you mention the war on terrorism and the Eurozone, so the mechanism designed to rescue the Eurozone. So this is the second feature, basically. Third, it's transnational administrative problem solving. So instead of political decisions by we the people, instead of collective self-determination, we have the unpolitical rule by technocrats. The administration without sovereignty, you're right, I could say policies without politics. So that's, and fourth feature, it's a neoliberal constitution. So it's in which the citizens, as active member of a political community, is replaced by say, by the consumer, the market citizens, the self-entrepreneur, commodification instead of politics, interpassivity, so that is, we don't really believe that things go that well, but we passively accept received views and rely on the judgment of experts. So these are the features of, okay. If the picture is more or less correct, so my questions and criticism in a row, so just, so the first one is relates to the relationship between the various defining features of constitutionalism 3.0. So, in between, particular, I don't I didn't fully grasp the relation between international engagement, human rights law, European Convention of Human Rights on the one side, and emergency powers, technocracy, commodification, neoliberalism on the other. So I don't understand whether for you, in your reading, it is some sort of intrinsic necessity between these, or whether the relationship is purely accidental and contingent. Because if it were intrinsic necessity, so if they were bound together in an inextricable way, then your book would provide a formidable criticism to international justice. But you need to provide an argument, and possibly there is an argument in that regard, but I wanted to express it in a clear way. So, otherwise, if the link is purely accidental and contingent, then the concept of constitutionalism 3.0 is ill-conceived, because it mixes together things that are so, like, I don't know, the spread of written constitutions and the spread of personal computers, or I don't know. So it's contingent. There's no conceptual intrinsic. Okay. So this is the first question for him. The second question: in what sense is the state of things that you described under the label Constitutionalism 3.0 a kind of constitutionalism? Wouldn't the name simply "crisis of second post-war constitutionalism" be perhaps less intriguing, but more descriptively adequate label for these kind of developments? Constitutionalism is conceived by you and by many others as an emancipatory political project, no? So, and it is linked with these values: liberté, égalité, fraternité, and basically social freedom. Okay. So, if we accept your description of Constitutionalism 3.0, it is doubtful whether it is still a vehicle of those values. So, liberté is threatened when the state of exception becomes the rule. Social freedom is jeopardized. Égalité is reduced to the formal equality of passive consumers. No meaningful political action is possible. No fraternité is blocked. No redistributive policy. No social justice, and the like. So, please clarify the link between this and constitutionalism approach. Third point. As the references to the European Convention of Human Rights make clear, your inquiry is basically concerned with European constitutional developments, no? And partially with the United States, which basically make for the case of what constitutionalism 1.0 is. So they are the exemplar of constitutionalism. And if these three kinds of constitutionalisms are interpreted as three stages, in a way, three layers, then one would conclude that the Hegelian spirit of the world still inhabits Europe and travels somewhere between Berlin and Brussels, which is like once Napoleon on the horse after the Battle of Jena. But this is not meant to be a criticism. I mean, the focus on the European development, I'm perfectly fine with that. So, provided that you don't want to provide us with, so to say, a sort of overarching reconstruction of the history of world constitutionalism, seen from the perspective of objective spirit. In that case, I would doubt that we are at the forefront still. No, but the question is another one. So I'm perfectly fine with a book that in so clever way and clarifies certain important constitutional developments which mainly but not exclusively affect Europe. So the question is simply this. So are these insights equally applicable to Germany and to Greece? So provided that the scene is Europe. So, to Austria and Hungary and Poland, so to the global constitution is the constitution of a nation state under conditions of international engagement. But such an engagement takes different shapes, no? Depending on the side you are sitting. So in Italian we say, I don't know if it's in Italian, depending on whether you hold the knife on the side of the handle or on the blade. So the question is, to what extent are your ideas equally applicable, different, okay, to this and that. And if I have a few more minutes, yes. Okay. There's a last question, which is actually my notes are quite sketchy here, so I will try to put it. So it relates to the dialectic between universalism and particularism, and the role of the state. Your conclusion in the end. So you have this reasoning. So about we have this tension with the dialectical process between, on the one side, universalism of human rights, but ultimately market economy, global capitalism, okay, in universe. And we have the particularity of nation states, the people, so and peer review in a way mediates. But as Hegel himself knew, there can be also a dialectic between two universalisms at the plural. So he had in mind Enlightenment and Christianity. No? So, and here there's basically one universalism, which is market economy. So the universalism is, on the one side, the state; on the other side, these globalizing tendencies. And it seems to me that something is missing from the picture. So what is completely missing, but I might be wrong, but I think that somebody, or some of the discussants also raised a similar point, is, so for instance, the agents of constitutional transformation, social movements, for instance, or political parties, or in a way, which are in a way the bearer of the universal, put in a Hegelian way. Sometimes they are. I mean, egalitarianism, social justice, democracy, and the like, and which are not abstract values, but they are also embodied in practices and in concrete, in social relationship and in organizations, in a way. So I don't know. Social movements, political parties, transnational political parties, labor or trade unions. And what happens is that the social freedom that these form of collective, not self-determination, but participation creates, are, as a matter of fact, already outside the state. So it's not that the state is the only site of social freedom and political engagement and political participation. And it's not the case that the only universalism there in place is the universalism of the market. No? You could use Kant against Hegel. No, Kant writing about on the issue whether human race is in constant progress towards the best. No, and he said, okay, I don't have an empirical proof that is the case, but this kind of detached, rational, and yet passionate participation that people had after French Revolution, events going there in another country, makes me think that maybe there is. And there is this kind of detached and rational participation, which is basically originated by the fact that the problem that they face in other countries, in other states, are basically very similar to the problem. Sometimes they are similar problems, and so social freedom already exercises itself outside the state, and then don't know whether your conclusion, nation states is the only place where meaningful, effective political agency can occur is in that sense convincing. Okay, that's just.
Before, I must confess that before the seminar, talking with Marco, we kind of expected that Giulio could have been the most critical of us, and I think he did it in a very nice way, and it makes a very promising next session that we are going to have in a quarter of an hour after a break. So hope you'll be back to hear the answers given by Alexander Zomek to the questions and the comment raised in the first half of the seminar.
6 pages of notes, yes, it may take a little bit. Yeah, okay, very good. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.